So now we're going to dig more deeply into social constructivism as international relations theory. And the question we really want to ask is, how does social construction shape outcomes in international politics? And the answer really is in the title of this slide: norms, identities, and interests. So here we want to talk about those three things and the mechanisms by which constructivists say they shape international politics. So let's begin with norms. We've defined norms, and this is from an academic article by Martha Finnemore and Catherine Sickink. Norms are a standard of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. And I've underlined a couple parts about that, right? The first is standard of appropriate behavior. That's a fancy way of simply saying of an idea about right and wrong, right? Norms have to do with what we think are right and wrong ways to behave. You might also call them morals or standards or even ethics. I emphasize given identity because norms apply to specific actors, right? A norm is something we expect an actor to do this, but we don't expect them to do that. And we'll get to the whole question of identity in just a second. But a good example of this is states are, quote unquote, allowed to use force. Not chemical weapons, though. But non-state actors are not considered to be allowed to legitimately use force, right? We call that crime, or we call it terrorism, or something like that. So depending on your identity, there are different norms for what you're allowed to do with force. But we could talk lots and lots more about norms, right? There are powerful norms, for example, against slavery now that didn't exist 200 years ago, and that was a big international question in the 19th century. Lots of other examples as well. But again, simply really ideas about what's right and wrong. So two questions. One is, how do they shape behavior? And the simple way of thinking about it is they raise the costs for certain behaviors, right? If you behave in a way that others think is morally wrong, they are probably going to be less likely to want to do business with you. And they may even put some kind of formal sanctions against you, or maybe even go to war against you. Another way in which they raise costs for certain behaviors is, in particular, if you're seen as untrustworthy, it becomes harder for you to make deals with people in the future because they don't trust you. And so all the benefits from cooperation that liberals point to are lost on actors who violate a lot of international norms. And again, think in this respect of a country like North Korea or Venezuela right now. Think about the impact that violating norms has had on Russia. But another thing that violating norms does is it takes away certain valued identities potentially, right? Do you get kicked out of clubs that you would like to be a member of? Do people stop referring to you as a democracy and you want to think of yourself as a democracy? Do people say, another good case involving Russia after its invasion of Crimea was the countries of the G8 said, we're not letting you come to our meetings anymore. We are now the G7. You're not part of it, right? So there can be identity costs for violating norms. Where do they come from is the second question. And this is a tough question that lots of books get written on, and there are no simple answers because they tend to be historical answers. They emerge over time, slowly but surely, oftentimes through the activities of specific advocacy groups. New norms emerge over time. And again, a colleague of mine has done a lot of work showing on how the international norm against slavery emerged in the 19th century, or in the 20th century, the norms against the kind of racism that was practiced by the government of South Africa spread over time. But in some cases, norms come from specific agreements. Countries get together, they negotiate treaties, and they say, this is no longer going to be accepted. So you think about some arms control agreements, like the ban on landmines or the ban on chemical weapons. Are new norms that come out of specific agreements. Identities. We've already talked a little bit about this. Who are the actors that we're talking about in any conversation, and what does it mean to have a particular identity? So I've given three examples here, and so one of them I'll talk about is neutrals. Some countries historically have declared themselves to be neutral, meaning they're not going to take a side in any conflict. And that's not merely a position, right? But that's also an identity. We're not part of this group. We're not part of that group. So Switzerland, think about the role that Switzerland has played in the world for a long time. It basically says, we're not joining any of you, but we'll do business with all of you. It's actually been very lucrative for Switzerland. But Sweden took this position during World War II. And of course, in our discussion of World War I, we pointed out that Belgium and the Netherlands had declared themselves to be neutral, but Germany violated that identity, and the idea that you don't invade neutrals was considered a norm, and so that actually was a big deal in the onset of World War I, or the spread of World War I should say. So another idea of identity that we've already talked about is Europe. The European Union can do what it does in part because all of those societies have a shared sense of what it means to be European, right? It's not just a deal. It's not just a set of trade agreements. It's a commitment to a we rather than just an I. And then the last one, historically, is the sovereign state, right? We pointed out when we talked about history that the sovereign state has not always existed. So when the sovereign state became prevalent in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was the rise of a new kind of identity. And what I point out that's especially important now is for a state to be really sovereign, it has to be recognized by others as sovereign, right? So the Donbas Republic, this splinter of Ukraine, isn't really considered a state. But Kosovo, which did not used to be considered a state, now is considered a state because it's been recognized and it's got a seat at the UN and so on. So this is a good example of how identities, right, are socially constructed. If everybody agrees that you're a state, well, then you're a state. And if others don't agree that you're a state, well, then you're, at least to some extent, you're not. Finally, let's talk about interests. And this is probably the simplest one, right? And interest is simply your goals or your aims. Realism, liberalism, and economic structuralism all assume interests, right? Realism derives it from sorts of basic assumptions about survival in an anarchic world. Economic structuralism derives it from capitalism and the class structure and so on. Well, constructivists want to do more. They want to ask really two questions. One is, where do they come from in the first place? And instead of just assuming it, they actually want to go investigate. And equally, or perhaps more interesting, they want to ask how they change, right? Neither realism nor liberalism nor structuralism really has a theory of how interests get redefined. So from the constructivist perspective, to the extent that interests are socially constructed, they can change without change in the underlying material factors that these other approaches look at. And that's then a key point, which is that interests can change without material factors behind them changing. And that means that interests change and behaviors can change without the stuff that realists, liberals, and economic structuralists look like. And the classic example of that is the end of the Cold War. 1989, 1990, 1991, the Soviet Union still had a jillion nuclear weapons, the US still had a jillion nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. But the Cold War pretty much just ended because the two sides said, instead of doing that, we're going to do this. They redefined their interests, and particularly the Soviets redefined their interests to say, it's too expensive and it's too dangerous, we're simply not going to play this game anymore. But that had nothing to do with the underlying factors that realists in particular, but also liberals and structuralists say ought to be shaping or constraining behavior. So to go to a theme, that I emphasize in the textbook, constructivism really focuses on how the purpose of political behavior, or the purposes that states pursue, emerge and how they change. And of course, the ability to shape purpose then can become a deep form of power. So it's not that there's no power in constructivism, it's that it's a completely different notion of power, right? Power is the ability to reshape these shared ideas, norms, interests, identities, and so on. So, question. How can constructivism complement realism, liberalism, and economic structuralism? I've presented it as a challenge to them, but we might also think about the ways in which it can complement.